you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the Gsmc Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. I gave blood again today, you guys. I give blood every 8 weeks now, and I just want you to know that if I seem a little bit out of it, well, that's why. The first needle stick did not go super well. She picked a side vein, and I don't know if it was the angle she went in or what, but it pinched a nerve or hit the bone or something. My poor little left arm aches now, but I'm okay. I'm totally fine. I'm not going to be a baby about it. But she ended up taking it from the right arm, and she got it first try on the right arm. To be fair, she only stabbed me once in the left one before I yelped like a wounded animal. Well, the wounded animal that I am. And she went ahead and swapped to the other arm. It's the first time I've ever yelped getting a blood draw. I've had that done a lot over the years. But there's a first time for everything. But you know, it turned out fine. I got my favorite color of bandage. And now we're going to talk about COVID-19 today. COVID is still a very prevalent problem, and rural cases have been increasing a lot within the United States. So we're going to talk about how that impacts health and wellness this far into COVID. So that's going to cover everything from what is potentially closing again, whether we're looking at these potential shutdowns and how that may impact our economic or financial wellness, as well as our social wellness. Stick around to the end when we talk about how to maintain fitness and wellness as we get closer to the winter months and are still enduring COVID-19. So first up, let's talk about the status of COVID-19 as we are right now. So currently it is November 23rd, 2020, and according to the CDC, there are cases rising. And these aren't just cases of people having it and quarantining at home, but also hospitalizations and deaths are rising across the United States. The cold weather is coming in now, and along with it comes flu season. Also, according to the CDC on a separate page, the flu virus usually occurs in the fall and winter, and although flu viruses can circulate year-round, most of the activity peaks between December and February, but it can also be seen as late as May. And depending upon whether you get a stomach virus or a respiratory virus, it can be a very different experience for you right now. But either way, it can cause some suppression of the immune system, as your immune system is fighting off a flu virus. And so adding COVID on top of that makes for a very dangerous flu season this winter. The CDC also estimates that influenza has resulted in between 9 million and 45 million illnesses, between 140,000 and 810,000 hospitalizations, and between 12,000 to 61,000 deaths annually since 2010. So COVID-19 has already killed about 230,000 people within the U.S. alone. And now we see that in an annual flu season in the U.S., that we can expect anywhere from 12,000 to 61,000 deaths from the flu specifically, normally, without COVID-19. So a lot of people over the past few months have been saying things, at least in my general vicinity, like, the flu kills a lot of people every year, too. This is only, twice as much as the flu, or now almost 4 times as much as the flu, depending on when they state that fact. But that's still a lot of deaths that are racking up. The death toll is increasing for COVID-19. And so there may be more people who become sick this year with the flu and subsequently develop COVID-19 when their respiratory system is already down. I also would like to note as an anthropologist that there are more cases, most cases are between December and February. And I want to talk about what that means. Now, the incubation period of the flu is usually 2 days, but it can be anywhere between 1 to 4 days, which means that after coming into contact with it, whether it be on the surface of something, a fomite, as we've discussed before, something inanimate, like a doorknob would be a fomite, or whether you get it from another person, it's going to be 1 to 4 days, typically, from when you came into contact with the flu on whatever surface, living or non-living. Now, as we've learned with COVID over the past several months, if you believe you've come into contact with someone who has COVID-19, that incubation period is up to about 14 days, which is why they want you to quarantine afterwards, just to make sure that those symptoms do not manifest. But the actual incubation period between SARS-CoV-2 and other coronaviruses like SARS-CoV and the MERS virus have ranged from 2 to 14 days. So now with that said, what is coming up this Thursday, the 26th? Well, that would be Thanksgiving, a time when people tend to gather together a lot in the US, specifically during flu season. Also, that's just a few days before the beginning of December, and that's really when flu season tends to peak, is December to February, which is really right around the time a lot of people are getting together for Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, and Valentine's Day. Thanksgiving and Christmas are the bigger ones, of course, because those are more likely to be large gatherings, whereas New Year's Eve might not be that large of a gathering. It might just be you and the people who are very close to you in your life, just really depending on who you are. Same goes for Valentine's Day in that way. But anthropologically, we want to look at the whys as well as the whats. So we know that COVID-19 cases are rising, and we know that it's a respiratory issue, and that the flu also tends to be the worst between December and February, although that is something that most people do tend to survive. So the CDC this year is saying that it is better, it's safest, for us to celebrate Thanksgiving at home with the people we live with. The people who are already in our quarantine pods are who they want us to spend Thanksgiving with this year. So we're going to discuss those CDC recommendations. So for their Thanksgiving tips, they want you to be celebrating with the people who are in your quarantine pod, as a lot of the cases over the past several months have been spread from, even during the quarantine period, by people getting together for things like birthday parties and other types of celebrations, of which Thanksgiving is one of. It's one of those types of celebrations where you have a moderate amount of people in the area who maybe don't see each other a lot, and this is their one time of year that they see each other. Very similar to birthday parties, weddings, funerals, things like that have been closed down, or rather advised against, over the past several months. Even when people felt otherwise safe to go ahead and gather, like everyone else that they knew was not likely to have it either. But according to the CDC, and in keeping up with the newspapers over the past few months, We've had over 1 million COVID cases reported in the United States in the last 7 days alone. And gatherings with people who don't live with us can increase the chances of getting or spreading COVID-19 or the flu. And it's really very similar to the principle of STDs. You can account for what you're doing, but you can't really account for what everyone else is doing. So, according to the CDC, they want you to avoid traveling because traveling can increase your chances of getting and spreading COVID-19. So they want people to postpone travel and to stay home right now to protect yourself and others. I've seen in a lot of the North Carolina hiking and camping pages that a ton of people are wanting to come to my local area and go camping right now or go hiking. And they don't really seem to realize that everyone's already out there doing that. So even though it's outdoors, you're likely going to see a lot of other people. And when you're on a trail on the side of a mountain, it's often difficult to maintain that 6 feet of distance from each other without falling into a ravine. So I urge you to reconsider those things, even if you think that you're not going to be that near other people. If it is a known trail or public park that is still open, then you very well may run into a lot of other people, as everyone else is likely having very similar thoughts to you too. If you are planning to still travel during Thanksgiving, there's some important questions to ask yourself and anyone who's either traveling with you or is going to come in contact with you that you know on your way. So of course you can't pre-interview strangers you're going to encounter at the gas station pumps, but these are some questions for the people in your life, either the ones accompanying you to the visit or the people you're visiting. So first up, are you or anyone else in your household or someone you're visiting going to be an increased risk of getting sick from COVID-19? Do they have any risk factors? Do they have heart problems, respiratory problems, or issues like diabetes that impact wound healing? Are the cases high or increasing in either the community you're traveling from or the one you're traveling to? You can use the CDC's COVID data tracker to find those latest numbers of cases in your general area. Are there hospitals in your community or where you're heading to that are overwhelmed with patients who have COVID? You can check state and local public health department websites to find out that information. My ex-boyfriend, whom I am still very good friends with, works in a hospital. He works in hospital administration, and he said that at a certain point, almost all of their beds were full. They were down to having less than 10% of those beds available, and that's because they've also had to reorganize their wards to allow for social distancing. So think about if you've ever been in the ER on, 4th of July, or Halloween, or any of the other big holidays where people tend to be in the ER a lot, or even in there in a regular night, just a Tuesday night at like 11 p.m. I've been there before, and there's quite a few people. And they all have different illnesses and different injuries that are going on. Their susceptibilities are going to be different. And just going to see the doctor right now can result in you picking up a nosocomial infection. And that's what people in the healthcare industry refer to as another infection that you pick up while you are in a hospital setting. And that's exactly what the term nosocomial means. It means a disease that has originated in a hospital, and that comes from the Greek root nosokomos, which means person who tends the sick. And then in the mid-19th century in English, that became nosocomial because we added that I-A-L to the end of it when we brought it into English. So check those CDC sites for the COVID data tracker, for the latest number of cases in the areas you live in, the areas you might be traveling to, and also check the state and local public health department websites to find out if the area you're headed toward is also overwhelmed with patients who have COVID-19. Remember, we're already going to see an upsurge of people going to the doctor for the flu right now, especially as folks try to figure out whether they have the flu or COVID-19. And remember, the hospitals are under capacity right now and doctors' offices, so they're not even able to normally handle necessarily what they might normally see on a busy night. We already had a nurse shortage in America, and now we're experiencing more healthcare personnel and healthcare management issues as the amount of people we're able to treat has shrunk due to the number of beds available and how far they have to be distanced. You also want to ask yourself if during the 14 days before your travel, have you or anyone you have visited had close contact with people that you don't live with, people outside of your quarantine pod? Do your plans include traveling by any means that might make it hard to stay 6 feet apart, like a bus, a train, or by air? Are you traveling with people who don't live with you? And does your home or destination have any requirements or restrictions for travelers? Several states still have quarantine rules activated. And so some folks are able to get you a COVID test before you can travel to make sure that you are able to safely travel and not have to quarantine, but others do not. It varies widely from state to state and just between local towns too. The CDC recommends that if you answered yes to any of the questions that I posed, that you should consider making other plans, like hosting a virtual gathering or delaying your travel. If you have to travel anyway, check for the travel restrictions before you go, get your flu shot, always wear a mask in public settings, especially when using public transportation and around people you don't live with. Try not to touch anything that you don't have to. That includes like bus rails, the grippy parts of buses or subways that help you stay in place and not fall over, the seats, everything. Remember, it's really hard to sanitize that in between people getting on and off so rapidly. So do your best to stay 6 feet apart. Try to wash your hands often or use hand sanitizer if you're able to, but don't forget to moisturize. You don't want your hands getting cracks in them because you have over hand sanitized. But also try not to touch your mask, your eyes, your nose, or your mouth, and stay up to date on these things as the time gets closer for your trip. Remember, hand sanitizer should have at least 60% alcohol, and make sure you keep your mask in a safe place while you're eating and drinking. Let's not put it on the table or anything like that because we don't want to cross-contaminate anything. We don't want to transfer respiratory droplets from our mask onto the table and turn that table into a new fomite. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about the different restrictions in different states. Stay tuned.
Are you looking to learn more about the latest trends from the fitness world? Are you confused by all of the different trends that are out there? The Gsmc Fitness Podcast is the place for you. The Gsmc Fitness Podcast is the place to come for people of all skill and interest levels. Join us as we explore the latest trends in the fitness world. Does that new exercise really work? Should I try yoga? Whatever your question, chances are good you'll find an answer on the Gsmc Fitness Podcast.
COVID-19 and the flu season, as well as the CDC's travel guidelines for this Thanksgiving. Now we're going to talk about what the different states may expect of you if you're considering interstate travel this fall. So many different states have reported a lot of new cases. We've seen a large increase in the past few weeks. Since October, it had lowered in October and seemed to almost stabilize a little bit. But now the amount of cases are soaring. So for Alabama, for instance, they had 544 reported cases October 6th. But by November 6, we had 1,556 in Alabama alone. So that has pretty much tripled. This week in Alabama, they have hit their peak, which is higher than it was even in the July-August wave. So they're at over 2,463 reported cases as of November 20th. So they have minor restrictions. Their gyms, personal care businesses like salons and barbershops, etc., beaches, retail stores, those are still open. States like Alaska also are experiencing a sharp increase in the COVID cases. For example, they had, 147 cases on October 3rd, and then by November 19th, 493. So it's growing exponentially most of the places. Arizona looks very similar. Now, Alaska does not have any restrictions right now, but states like Arizona do have it. And the one thing that you can see as you look at these different states is that regardless of the shape of the curve, statistically, for these graphs of the reported COVID cases by month and also different dates within the month. So they're still, regardless, having a huge uptick in cases right now. So Arkansas had 488 cases on October 4th, I want to say, and now we are seeing them at their 7-day average for November 16th being 1,554, and for the 20th, 2,061. So we have almost 5 times as many in Arkansas now than we did even a month ago. And the peak for July, at least according to the data in the Washington Post, is that during July and August, the highest it got was about 824, which is only twice as much as what we were seeing on October 4th. But that also means that we had a decline of about 400 between the end of July and the beginning of October, but now it's climbing even more, and we're at 2,000 and some cases and change in Arkansas right now, and they still have minor restrictions, so you can do outdoor recreation and things like that. So you can look at these online. Some states like California have major restrictions, and they're looking at over 8,000 reported cases averaged in the past week. So definitely Google the individual states that you will be traveling to and through to make sure that you are able to follow the rules that they are setting forth. Each state looks wildly different. Colorado has moderate restrictions. California has major ones. Some places have state parks open, and some places only certain parks are open. Or you're allowed to hike there, but not camp there necessarily. Also, some states like Illinois have moderate restrictions, but they vary by region that you're in. So local areas have made more or fewer restrictions, I suppose, than what the rest of the state is up to. So it's important to Google the specific locale that you're going to in addition to the state at large. Now, there are some very detailed charts and information online for you. I found a lot of these from the Washington Post, but to get the most up-to-date information about what's happening in the specific areas of interest to you, do check your state or local government's specific website instead of going to these pages. So for example, when I first looked at the Washington Post site, it says it was last updated on September 11th, and it does give a little warning at the top that the page is no longer being updated anymore. The graphs that are being used are being updated, but only the graphs. The timeline of events only goes up to October 2nd for some of them, but most of them don't have an update since August. It's only the graphs themselves and their data that have been updated. So there's probably a master list of that somewhere, and they are live updating it through there. We used to do something like that at my old IT job, in which you would have all of these graphs that went to these different pages, but they were all updated in the one place, and then it just automatically changed via the different mechanisms we had to make auto updates work smarter, not harder. So the graphs are still updated, but not the rest of the information. So to get the most updated information, do check to see when that info was posted and or updated, and heed any warnings like that that say that that page is no longer being updated. You want the most up-to-date information. Old news is not really that useful for us in the middle of a pandemic. So we still want to vet our sources like we would for anything else. So check out the CDC website. Also check out your state and local government's websites for the areas you're going to. I know that might sound daunting to do this amount of research because it's so different from what we're used to as Americans. We take interstate travel as something that we can just do. Like, we take it for granted, really. And it's a lot different now when we are having to worry about the pandemic and how interstate travel can result in mandatory quarantines in some places. But if you're heading to a family member's house, you can also ask that family member about what they know of the current status of COVID-19 in their local area and in their state in general. If they don't actually know any of that information, it's a good time for both of you to learn about it, since you'll both be inhabiting those places at the same time. But y'all already know I'm a big proponent of knowing both your rights and your responsibilities. Overall, a good predictor of COVID activity is seeing if those states had previously lifted coronavirus restrictions. A lot of states have lifted them and have had to reverse course as those cases started surging. In the Sun Belt area particularly, we have seen a lot of hospitals filling up, and the spread is rapidly increasing. The holidays are already a stressful time, and as we know, our bodies are sensitive to stress. So let's do our best to be kind to ourselves and each other during this holiday season, and be mindful of ourselves when traveling. Remember to use some gloves, specifically latex or nitrile type gloves if possible, for pumping gas and such along the way. And you also might want to check and see which places will be open for using the restroom. I don't know exactly what traveling across the country looks like right now, but when I did move from Texas to North Carolina in June of this year, it was very difficult to find a place to go in to pee in many states, but also difficult to find a place that was open for food, and depending on the size of your car, that you could go through the drive-thru for. So you may want to pay extra special attention to those type of stops this time of year, as well as to being kind to yourself and to others to help keep everyone's stress down and help promote better health and wellness for everyone around you. I try to practice that all of the time, but it is especially important right now during COVID-19 and the holidays as we navigate this brand new world. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about how some fitness centers are rebranding to try to get around COVID rules, and how a second shutdown may or may not be coming. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
restrictions by state and region and how to find out some information about those. Now we're going to talk about whether or not another shutdown may be coming. So recently, a lot of states have seen an uprise in their COVID-19 numbers for reported illnesses, hospitalizations, and deaths. According to some scientific models, we may be anticipating COVID-19 death tolls tripling by mid-January. Remember, December through February tends to be the height of flu season, and this is also a respiratory illness, so we may be seeing people more susceptible to this and more exposed to it due to gatherings like for Christmas and Thanksgiving as we go into the winter months. So what does that really mean for us? Well, I know that no one really enjoyed being in lockdown, except for perhaps some kids who got to stay home and play video games a lot. But for the most part, it was really brutal and painful for a ton of Americans, especially as it relates to job security and finances. The corporate bailout that a lot of companies got, along with folks who received that $1,200 stimulus package several months ago, they ended up firing a lot of the employees. Instead of using that package to help out their employees or anything like that, to keep them stably employed, a lot of companies ended up laying off large portions of their workforce. Now, I'm not really talking about small companies. Small companies are small and they have limited funds. I'm talking about the big boys, the international, or really, if we're being honest with ourselves about the nature of it, global companies. The big boys, the ones you think of when you think of terms like department store or online shopping, things like that. So that wasn't truly helpful to the American people at large. It did not result in them having stable employment or a stable life position. A lot of people were at risk of losing not only their jobs, but also their homes, as they could no longer pay rent until some places enacted rent freezes. Student loans were also temporarily postponed for their mandatory repayments. And so a lot of it was a mixed bag, but it did stop hospitals from overflowing, although a lot of them came very close, like I was discussing with my friend's position as a healthcare management worker at a level 1 trauma center and public hospital in Texas. And then we had a lot of states open really quickly. A lot of people reopened what was perhaps a bit too soon. Now I say perhaps because I understand that different people have different opinions, but largely, according to scientific experts in the areas, we did open too quickly again. So we had a bout with the third quarter phenomena. And the third quarter phenomena is this concept that they've seen a lot with astronauts and other people on long trips. So like going to the Antarctic research stations to perform research for several months at a time, or going into space to work on the International Space Station, or whatever else they're up there doing. You're on these extended trips, but they found in different studies that people are fine up until about the 75% mark. So in the third quarter, that's right when you're going, okay, there's now more time behind me than there is in front of me. So there's more time that has lapsed since I got here than there is since I'll get to leave. So after a certain amount of time, you get this sense that other people are starting to irritate you and you're ready to go. You see a decline in morale during the third quarter and also a decline in performance, especially in missions where it's very isolated or confined or extreme. And that doesn't matter how long the actual mission is. Whether you're spending 3 months in an Antarctic research station or over a year in space, it's that 3-quarter mark each time that ends up with people having a decline in their performance and getting very frustrated. So this 3rd quarter phenomenon has been linked to this discomfort after stress has passed. So once you think that you're really that far into it, it makes you feel like, okay, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Well, I meant to say tunnel, not tumble, but I do feel that 2020 has sent us end over tea kettle this year, so I'm gonna leave that in there because it feels very apt, even if it was misspoken. But we do feel like there's a light at the end of this tunnel, but now we're chomping at the bit to get to it. And people become distressed because they have that knowledge that the first half of what they had to do is over, but a very similar length of time stretches onward in front of them. So the 3rd quarter phenomenon takes place sometime in the 3rd quarter, but that may be right at the end of the 2nd quarter. And it's this distress that has a very sharp impact on both morale and mood. So we had an artificial 3rd quarter phenomenon earlier this year when we had been quarantining for a couple of weeks and we had been told, hey, it's only going to be a couple of weeks or it's only going to be a little bit. And the problem with that is that it created an artificial 3rd quarter phenomenon, in my opinion. And by that, I mean that people in the media, people at least that we see on the media, whether they be politicians or scientists or news reporters, we're saying things like, oh, we're about halfway through this, or, the worst it's going to get is going to be in July and August. And so we got very excited and we're like, hey, we're almost there. There's a light at the end of this tunnel. It's sometime at the end of July or August when this is really going to peak and be very bad. And then things will get better because it's always darkest before the dawn, right? But because of that, it gave us an artificial timeline for COVID-19. And that's really important to take into account. Remember, everyone got really depressed. They were baking a lot of bread back then. All of the grocery stores were out of yeast. I feel like I'm talking about years ago, but this was a mere handful of months ago. This was still in the same year that we're in right now. So everyone really stopped freaking out as much about toilet paper, but morale was very low. People were sad and upset. Everyone was playing the House Party app. People were watching Quibbies and things like that. Things that have been born and died in the past several months related to technology, as it's specifically related to what being at home all the time looks like, what this period of isolation that is associated with the 3rd quarter phenomenon has really wrought. Now, because we have this artificial deadline with the 3rd quarter phenomenon, now we are getting that deadline extended again. We're looking at having to go back to before that halfway point. And I anticipate that a lot of people are going to be distressed by this. Not just for financial reasons, although that is certainly a big enough qualifier in and of itself, but also because of the 3rd quarter phenomenon. It's psychological, and they found in all of these studies that it did not matter how long the trip was. It's mostly psychological, and it's just us perceiving that halfway point, no matter what that may be. That may be a couple of months, it could be years. Now, I'm not saying that COVID-19 is going to last years, but what I am saying is that we've known from the beginning that it takes about 14 months minimum to really get an efficacious and safe vaccine. And they started those vaccine trials in February, March of last year. And they expedited that process. They skipped a lot of steps that they normally are not allowed to skip for finding this vaccine, just because this is so serious. And so we're only 8 months into that? So the fact that they tried to tell us that it was not going to take this long is upsetting to many from an epidemiological point of view, but also from an anthropological perspective, because a lot of life, especially if you work in business, is about managing expectations. And this fumble in the third quarter phenomenon has the potential to really throw everyone a curveball in the midst of not only regular depression or COVID depression, but also seasonal depression and flu season on top of COVID-19, and having to come to terms with the fact that many of us will not be able to visit family members this year. And I know a lot of people were looking forward to the holidays because it's the one time of year a lot of people go home. But we also have to keep our loved ones' health in mind, and a lot of our loved ones that we see this time of year are older, and they are more predisposed to getting COVID, and if they do get COVID, getting a serious case and dying from it. And it's important to also consider that for a lot of these older folks, they may not be living very much longer. I hate to say it that way, but that doesn't even just go for people who are older. There are also people who are still getting terminal illnesses, or they're still dealing with terminal illnesses as COVID-19 and 2020 continues to progress. And they might not have a very certain future. We've lost a lot of people this year, not just to COVID-19, but also to the run-of-the-mill illnesses that are terrible, but we take for granted every day, like different kinds of cancers. We've been so focused on COVID-19, we haven't really talked about the large amount of people, including celebrities, who died from other illnesses and injuries like cancer and heart disease, the things that normally are killing people. Remember, these things are still happening in the background, and we're adding COVID to that, not in place of that. So for a lot of folks, they don't know if this is going to be their last Thanksgiving or Christmas, or their family's last Thanksgiving, Christmas, or their friends, or their lovers. And I can understand and empathize with how people are feeling in that regard, and trying to weigh the difference between going and seeing their family members whom they might not get a chance to see again because of variables we're already aware of. But also that they're having to go, I could potentially expose them to COVID. What do I do? It's a very strong emotional problem that we're all facing. I know COVID is an epidemiological one, but it's also a financial one, and an emotional toll is being enacted on people all over the world right now. I mostly focus on the US since that's where this podcast goes right now, but everyone all over the world is experiencing this to different ends, and the third quarter phenomenon doesn't really help anyone. Having these artificial timelines of saying, oh, hey, this is when it'll be over, that doesn't help anyone. And we shouldn't really believe most people when they tell us that it's almost over. They're telling us what we want to hear. And my personal belief system and experience, I am skeptical of people who tell me what I want to hear. I'm much more likely to listen if you are telling me something I don't want to hear, because you're presenting an alternative viewpoint, and there is a social contract that goes along with that. It's managing expectations again. You have something to lose if you tell me something you know I don't want to hear, whereas you only have things to gain by telling me what I want to hear. It's just a healthy dose of skepticism is what I am recommending, and checking the sources from these people. Because when we blindly believe in these politicians and journalists telling us that it's all almost over, while the epidemiologists, the people who are experts in viruses, are telling us, hey, this is going to keep spreading and this is how this works, that's a problem. Remember, epidemiologists don't just study the viruses and the other types of microbes that can make us ill. They also study how the people who contract them tend to act, and how it ends up spreading, both virally or epidemiologically, if it's a bacteria, etc. Let's cover all of it with epidemiologically, but also how it is spreading between people, like quite literally, like with the flow of travel, etc. Something anthropologists also look into, and sociologists. This is what they dedicate their lives to, and they're the experts in how this is spreading and what is likely to help fix it versus what is likely to make it worse. So make sure that you are researching the sources you're getting your information from, and let's all go into this like we should with elections, and that is with an informed opinion, to make sure we're able to help combat not only misinformation, but also the results of misinformation, such as this artificial third quarter phenomenon. We were likely going to experience a third quarter phenomenon regardless, but now we're looking at facing several different ones, and that can really negatively impact morale. Morale might sound like it's not that big of a deal, but from a leadership perspective, whether that is in business or the military or the Peace Corps or in different types of hostile situations, that is a very big factor in how well everyone is going to ultimately fare. Remember that another issue we've been facing with COVID-19 deaths has had a lot to do with depression and suicide, these feelings of loneliness as well. And we also tend to see more suicides during the winter months that we're coming up on, especially as they relate to holidays. So we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about some ways to help yourself and others with your health and wellness during COVID-19 in the wintertime. Stay tuned.
The Gsmc Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the Gsmc Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the Gsmc Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about whether or not we might be looking at another shutdown, as well as the third quarter phenomenon and what this past year has brought us in that aspect. Now we're going to talk about what to do about it. There's not a lot that we can do to combat COVID-19 as individuals. This is not the Star Trek episode Macrocosm, where all of the epidemiological cells that are needing to be fought are on the macroscopic level, where they can be seen and literally physically fought. We are having to rely upon healthcare experts and disease experts to help us fight this disease. We're having to trust public policymakers to make the right decisions. And we also have to hold people accountable during local elections, in addition to the big elections, when they make choices that are not in the best interests of the people. We also briefly touched earlier on how stress can cause a decline in your health. So we've talked about that at length in other episodes about stress, including the involvement of stress hormones like cortisol and how that can negatively impact your body overall. It's why we tend to get sicker when we are feeling like we're no longer under a lot of stress. We get sick on our days off because we can finally relax. And perhaps we're also seeing an uptick in COVID, not just because we're becoming more lax about what's expected of us and feeling artificially like we're exiting the fourth quarter, having worked our way through our artificial third quarter morale and mood issues, but perhaps also because we are resolving our third quarter phenomenon stress. A lot of folks that I know seem to think that things are getting better right now, when in fact they are getting worse. Not to negate the fact that they were getting better for a while, but we're seeing another rise in the numbers again, just like Dr. Fauci, the CDC, the WHO, and all of the other health experts had predicted earlier this year. So stress is playing a large role in our cycles of health and wellness. And we tend to see a lot of it, even before now, in non-COVID years, around the holidays, as people are worried about buying presents, which we're going to see probably more people stressed out about that because of COVID-19 financial issues. Also, weight loss issues. People are going to start feeling some type of way about their body at the holidays, especially as we see family. Family also likes to poke at things like whether or not you are married or have children or have finished your thesis or have changed jobs or if you're still working that job you hate. Things like that. So this year, I would like to emphasize more self-love and forgiveness for this season. For yourself and for others, but really, let's be honest, forgiveness is more for us than for anyone else. It's about protecting your peace, as my best friend would put it. And so we're going to talk about some self-compassion practices that'll help you give yourself a break. Now, I know a lot of you might be rolling your eyes at me right now because you may also be a type A person, like I am. Well, my friend, it's difficult to do, but we also have to get comfortable with things being good enough, at least for this holiday season. I don't want to do anything that I can't do perfectly, and that's a flaw that I'm working on in myself. But I think that it's also something that we can all pay attention to this year. Overall, I think that forgiveness is an underutilized tool, even within myself. I am going to be very transparent about that. It's really difficult to forgive someone, but most things that are important in life don't necessarily come easily. You have to work at them, and I think that it's a solid endeavor, and it helps us be happier. Being upset with ourselves all the time isn't healthy. Remember, we've talked about how optimists are naturally healthier than people who are realistic or pessimistic. And that's been the biggest driver for me when it comes to considering a more optimistic worldview and me adopting one. It seems very outside of my nature. However, when I'm thinking about my health and wellness, that's a better argument for me as somebody who does consider themselves to be very pragmatic than anything else. And self-compassion is a way that we can work on that. I think that we tend to cut other people more slack than we cut for ourselves, at least if you're type A. So you might not be really great at even recognizing how you can give yourself a break, because it sometimes looks very different from how you do that for others. But firstly, I want you to try to give yourself a gentle pass when it comes to not getting everything done or the outcome of your productivity. You don't have to use all of this time right now to learn how to bake the best sourdough. I mean, if that's your jam, then do it. But if it doesn't come out perfectly, that's okay. You're going to scientific method it, and you'll try again. But there doesn't have to be stress involved in the scientific method. Remember, if we look at it as a scientific method, then we also accept failure as a step forward. It's more knowledge and data than you had before, and so you can move forward with more information than before and therefore have a better shot. But we don't want to beat ourselves up about failure. It's okay if you worked out all summer and now you've gained some weight back. You have worked on it before, and you can work on those health goals again. If you have gained weight intentionally and then also ended up losing it back, you can gain it again. You have worked your way up to that before, and you can work your way back to it again. I think a lot of it has to do with us looking at goals as things we absolutely have to do, rather than things that we would like to do. Not all goals come to fruition, and that's okay. A lot of them aren't reached at the same pace either. You might have wanted to reach a certain goal within 6 months, and then COVID happened, and that just did not work out for you. You can try a different goal, or a new goal, or a totally modified goal, and go from there. Maybe you just need another couple months on it, or something like that. But you don't want to overwhelm yourself and thereby stress yourself out by getting upset that you're not already fluent in Spanish this far into the quarantine, or that you're not going full beast mode in chess or something. There are lots of goals we used to have as kids that if we look back on them now, they may seem very silly or unnecessary or just even downright weird in a lot of cases. But some we've kept along the way, and some we have put on a back burner, or we've totally discarded and decided that the version of us that we're working on right now isn't really into that anymore. Did you do a lot of scrapbooking when you were the 4-H club secretary? Sure. Did you enjoy it then? Maybe. But do you enjoy scrapbooking now for funsies? No, and that's okay. Now that is my own personal experience, but you get where I'm coming from. There are some things we do enjoy over the years, and then we no longer enjoy them. And that isn't a failure, and we don't need to shame ourselves for it. We're just going to work on our mindset. And that's what step number 2 is changing your current mindset. So don't focus on what you haven't done or what you can't do, but on the things that you can. It's like the addict's prayer. God, grant me the courage to change the things I can, the serenity to accept the things I cannot, and the wisdom to know the difference. So yes, COVID is very stressful, but focusing on what we're not doing and self-flagellating about it isn't going to help us get it done, and it's not going to make us feel better. In fact, it doesn't really accomplish anything at all. It can actually create paralyzing anxiety and depression and result in other mood disorders, which can also be influenced by or result in sleep disorders. And then you're caught in a cycle. So instead, think about what you can achieve. Also, bolster yourself by thinking about the things that you have achieved in the past and how and what you can plan for in the future. I'm a big fan of reframing, and you can also make long and short-term goals. So perhaps you haven't reached that long-term goal yet, but maybe you can break it into smaller short-term goals that will help you advance further this time. Remember, third quarter phenomenon applies to a lot of different contexts in isolation. So if you're new to working at home and things like that too, maybe try another route. This is a bigger shakeup for a lot of people psychologically than I think many folks initially realized. It's also important to let your feelings be felt. That is part of you. And intellectualizing your grief doesn't necessarily help prevent it or help ameliorate it. It just kind of stuffs it down. And I do say that from experience. Some of us are still learning to give ourselves space to express our authentic emotions or even to feel our authentic emotions. And that's some daily work that we all have to do. All of us are at different points on that journey, But if you haven't started yet, try to honor your emotions. If you're sad or frustrated, etc., you don't have to buy into toxic positivity and immediately try to feel better or shake it off. We don't want to wallow, but it is good to acknowledge our emotions and to feel them and to sit with them like you would perhaps a friend who is grieving or in pain. Provide that empathy to yourself that you would extend to others. You do deserve it, and you are worthy of it, regardless of any other circumstances in your life. When you're feeling helpless, one thing that helps me out is to help someone else. It isn't necessarily altruistic, especially if you're doing it to help you feel good, but you're also going to get some positive reinforcement from that dopamine when you do these things and then you feel better. And it's going to help make you a kinder, gentler person over time, a more considerate person. At first, you may have to work hard at this. Don't beat yourself up about it. Remember, this is a work in progress. We're all on different points of our journey, and there is no shame in being at a different point than someone else. We can't align ourselves with another person and say, hey, that person's my age, and they came from the area that I did, and they're so much further along in life than I am, and be upset about it. I mean, you could do that, but it's not going to help you, and it's not going to help them. Learning to help other people when you're feeling helpless, and also learning how to be happy for other people around you can be very, very helpful. I've been on this journey to be a kinder, gentler Alex for the past year and a half or so, and I don't know what my quarantine would really look like if I was still the Alex I was before. I can say from at least my anecdotal experience that helping others does help me, and that being kind also helps me be more relaxed. Today, when that nurse stabbed my arm and hit the nerve or a bone or whatever it was, I don't know what it was, my arm is still aching like when you have a fracture and a storm's coming though. But when she accidentally jabbed me in whatever she jabbed me in, and it immediately and deeply hurt, I did let loose somewhat of a yelp. And that yelp may or may not have been a bad word. And so when I did it, I felt very bad because it was just an automatic reaction from me. And I wasn't mad though. And there was no malice in my expression. But it can be very off-putting if you use coarse language around different people. And so I was aware of that and immediately went to reassure her, hey, it's cool. Sometimes it's really hard to draw my blood. And that isn't necessarily the entire truth. That one really was her bad. But I wasn't mad about it. I think a lot of people get angry when they get hurt because it's part of our natural reaction as animals, as natural creatures. It's a defense mechanism. As soon as you're harmed, you want to lash out. But that's not healthy for anybody. And I have worked on being a kinder, gentler Alex over the years to where I was able today to not even be mad. I didn't even have to think about not being upset about it. I wasn't at all. And my first reaction was to make sure that she was okay, because I did not want her to think that I was mad at her or that she was bad at her job or anything like that. That's not helpful to anyone. We're all stressed out, and she's performing a good job trying to get blood for people who need it. So we just swapped arms, and when I apologized to her for having yelped and everything, she goes, no, don't you apologize. And so we both met each other with kindness, and it was genuine on both parts. For me, ultimately, it was more embarrassing that I yelled the F word than anything else, because I was in such a public space, and it was a very visceral reaction. She got the other blood draw on the first go. I told her I believed in her, and she went ahead and went for it. I didn't act scared, and so that helped bolster her too. At least, I like to think so. Focusing on someone else's happiness and helping them to have a better life, even if it's just for the brief interaction that you have with them, can be really important. And it can look a lot of different ways. Every time I go to the coffee shop, they have a $5 credit card minimum, and I often forget cash. I'm very sorry, but I often forget cash. So whenever I go in there, I end up buying 2 drinks because my drink amount totals to $4.54. So if I don't have that exact change right now, I go ahead and buy 2 drinks. So what am I going to do with 2 caramel macchiatos? Well, I mean, I could totally just drink them, but I didn't want to sit with them both in my lap while I did my blood donation, and really, I don't need 2 coffees. So a lot of times I end up giving them away. And today I gave one away to the person who was working the Bloodmobile sign up. She was sitting outside. It was cold out. Did I have an iced coffee? Yes, but she was drinking an iced coffee before I came out there. I'd initially asked her if she wanted one, and she had said no, but when I walked out with 2, I was like, would you like this? And she's like, well, what is it? And I said, it's a caramel macchiato. And she was so in, because they're amazing drinks. But doing little things like that, buying an extra beverage or an extra sandwich and giving it away to someone, it's really helpful as a person. It brightens your day. It also brightens the day of people around you, and that can spread exponentially. In order for me to be healthy right now, I need to work on not being as stressed out. But I also want to make sure that others aren't stressed out, because they're also susceptible to COVID-19, and if I'm coming into contact with them, they're also making me susceptible to COVID-19. Or rather, I am taking my life into my hands by putting myself in a situation in which I may be susceptible to COVID-19, because I don't know where the blood bank people have been. They travel around a lot, they see a lot of different people. But in my cost-benefit analysis, this is something that is important for me to do. We do currently have a blood shortage. So my point is really that self-care can also look like caring for others. It doesn't have to be the us versus them mentality that has been so prevalent throughout all of human history, and especially, again, on the rise right now. I say especially not because it's greater in magnitude than before, but rather that it's particularly relevant to everyone's current lives because we are living that history in this moment. And how it's shaped really depends on us. So by learning to be happy for other people and just being chaotically kind can really help us to also acknowledge golden nuggets, something in mindfulness that's really referring to little moments of enjoyment during your day. It helps us to practice gratitude and positivity without being toxically positive, without overdoing it. But those nuggets can really help us out, and they can help out other people. And if we're able to cultivate awe in our natural environment, even something as small as still getting excited every time you see a cat that is in a neighborhood and it's not a cat that you already know. That'll never get old for me. Getting to see deer in the wild will never get old for me, even though I grew up with them and I have been around a bunch of them. I have petted them. I've been immersed in them over the years. But getting to see one in the wild will always induce awe in me. Now, some of those things, like seeing wild animals, are by chance, but you can also do this mindfulness habit of collecting these golden nuggets by starting to intentionally notice 2 or 3 things that you enjoyed or you did well that day. And that can be anything like waking up before your alarm goes off, or maybe even getting more done than you expected. But I don't want to put a lot of emphasis on productivity, as that can end up being toxic too. But maybe you made your coffee perfectly that morning, or whoever made your coffee made it perfectly. There's nothing like a perfect cup of coffee, am I right? But these little things like a perfect cup of coffee, or a really great meal, or a child getting the craziest set of the giggles you have ever heard in your life, or snorting milk, or discovering that blowing bubbles into milk is hilarious for the very first time. It's really the little things, these tiny moments, that are building blocks of happiness and of mindfulness and of life. So during this really stressful time, regardless of what happens going forward, if we end up in another shutdown or not. That it's important for our own health and that of everyone else around us, and therefore also herd immunity, to love ourselves and to project that kindness onto others. In a similar concept to fake it until you make it, you can also practice being kind to others until it becomes easier to be kind to yourself, until it becomes second nature to be kind to other people. And doing that for yourself becomes ultimately easier. So put your critical voice on mute. Don't beat yourself up about how that pumpkin pie turns out or whether or not you're able to go home. If you don't feel safe to go home and your family gets upset about it, yeah, that's gonna suck. But we can reframe it. And we can allow them the space to feel their feelings and be upset without tearing ourselves down at the same time. So let's try to spread some compassion this holiday season. Make sure that we are doing our best to keep ourselves and others safe, de-stressed, and well in our pursuits of happiness, no matter where they may take us or not take us this COVID holiday season. Thank you for listening to the Gsmc Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the Gsmc Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Health and Wellness Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.